Have you ever faced a moment where all hope is lost? When the person you love most in the world is fading before your eyes and doctors tell you to prepare for the worst? This is a story about that moment. It's about a love that refused to surrender and a whispered secret in a sterile hospital hallway that sparked a desperate journey. What would you do if the only chance to save your world was hidden behind the door of a total stranger? Stay with me, because the answer is more shocking than you could ever imagine. Chloe and Ethan had a life people dreamed of. They lived in a sun-drenched apartment in Chicago's Lincoln Park, with stunning views of the city skyline. Ethan, a brilliant software engineer, was the rock of their world. He was a man who had built himself from nothing, having aged out of the Illinois foster care system, with nothing but determination and a sharp mind. Chloe, a graphic designer, came from a loving, supportive family who adored Ethan as their own son. Their love was the kind you see in movies, effortless, deep, and true. They were planning for the future, for a family, for a lifetime together. But a shadow was creeping in, a mysterious illness that began with simple fatigue and quickly unravelled their perfect world, revealing a devastating diagnosis that no amount of love or money could seem to fix. The April air outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital was crisp, carrying the promise of a Chicago spring. But for Chloe, sitting on a cold wrought-iron bench in the hospital's sterile courtyard, the world felt like it was ending. The scent of blooming tulips was a cruel joke. How could life be so vibrant when hers was crumbling into dust? Just an hour ago she was holding Ethan's hand, his skin pale and thin, his grip weak. He had been a force of nature, a man who could run a marathon and code for 18 hours straight. Now he was tethered to a web of tubes and monitors, his body waging a war it was losing. He had smiled at her, that same tired, brave smile. "We'll get through this, Chloe," he'd whispered, his voice raspy. But she had seen the truth in Dr. Thorne's eyes earlier that day, a truth that was clinical, final, and utterly devastating. The hope was gone. All that was left was the hollow echo of beeping machines and the unbearable weight of borrowed time. Dr. Marcus Thorne was a man who dealt in facts, not miracles. He had a kind face, but his eyes held the weary look of someone who delivered bad news for a living. "The experimental treatment isn't working, Chloe," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "His body is rejecting the therapy. The aplastic anemia is progressing too rapidly." Chloe just stared at the chart in his hands, a collection of lines and numbers that spelled out a death sentence. "What about the donor list? The bone marrow transplant?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Thorne sighed, a sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the small, sterile office. "Ethan has a very rare HLA type. Without a direct blood relative, finding a match in the National Registry is a 1 in a million shot. And I'm afraid we're out of time." 1 in a million. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. For Ethan, a man who had spent his entire life without a family, that 1 in a million chance felt like 0. Chloe's mind reeled back to a different spring, years ago. A crowded coffee shop near the Northwestern campus, the air thick with the smell of roasted beans and the buzz of students cramming for finals. She was sketching in her notebook when a voice, warm and a little hesitant, asked if the seat across from her was taken. It was Ethan. He wore a faded hoodie and worn-out jeans, his hair a little messy, but his eyes were the kindest she had ever seen. There was an immediate pull, an unspoken connection that made her heart beat a little faster. He wasn't like the other guys she knew, the ones with their easy confidence and trust funds. There was a quiet strength in him, a depth that hinted at a life already lived. He made her laugh with a dry, witty comment about her complicated coffee order, and for the next 2 hours they talked as if they'd known each other for years. It was easy, natural. It felt like coming home. On their third date, walking along the shore of Lake Michigan, with the city lights twinkling like fallen stars, he told her everything. He spoke about the foster care system, not with self-pity, but with a matter-of-fact resilience that stunned her. He talked about moving from home to home, the loneliness, the constant feeling of being an outsider. He explained how he taught himself to code from library books, seeing it as his only ticket to a stable life. "I just decided that I was going to be the one to bet on myself," he had said, looking out at the dark water, "because nobody else was going to." In that moment, Chloe didn't just like him. She was in awe of him. She saw the incredible man he had forged from the ashes of a forgotten childhood. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. She knew then, with absolute certainty, that she would never let him be alone again. Her parents, who had always been a little overprotective of their only daughter, fell for Ethan instantly. Her father, a successful architect, respected Ethan's grit and ambition. "That young man has more character in his little finger than most men I know have in their whole body," he'd declared after their first meeting. Her mother adored his gentle nature and the way he looked at Chloe, as if she were the only person in the world. They married in a beautiful ceremony at the Chicago Botanic Garden, surrounded by friends and family. It was a perfect day. Ethan, who had never had a real family, was suddenly surrounded by one. He wept when Chloe's father called him son during his wedding toast. They built a life filled with laughter, travel, and ambitious dreams. They wanted a big family, a house full of noise and chaos, to fill the quiet spaces of Ethan's past. They were invincible. They were forever. Or so they thought. The first sign something was wrong was subtle. Ethan, who always had boundless energy, started coming home from work exhausted. He'd fall asleep on the couch before dinner, something he never did. Then came the strange, unexplained bruises on his arms and legs. "I must be getting clumsy in my old age," he'd joke. But Chloe felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She booked him a doctor's appointment, convinced it was just a vitamin deficiency or burnout. "They'll tell you to take a vacation," she'd said, trying to sound cheerful. But the initial blood test came back with alarms. More tests followed. Specialists were consulted. The days blurred into a haze of sterile waiting rooms and anxious phone calls. The world they had so carefully built began to feel fragile, like a house of cards in a hurricane. The final diagnosis was a brutal, blindsiding blow, a rare and aggressive autoimmune disease that was causing his own body to destroy his bone marrow. Their long and painful journey with IVF had ironically prepared them for this medical battle. For 3 years they had navigated a world of appointments, injections, and crushing disappointments. Each failed attempt was a heartbreak, but Ethan had been her constant source of strength. "It's you and me, Chloe. That's what matters," he would say, holding her as she cried. "A baby would be a wonderful bonus, but you are my entire world." It was Ethan who finally made the call to stop. "I can't watch this hurt you anymore," he'd said, his voice firm but full of love. "Your health, your happiness, that's my priority." Now, as she sat in the hospital, the irony was unbearable. She had put her body through so much to create a life that might have been a genetic match, a potential saviour for the man who had only ever wanted to protect her. The thought was a fresh stab of guilt in a heart already shattered with grief. Chloe forced herself to leave the quiet courtyard and walk back into the hospital. The smell of antiseptic and floor polish assaulted her senses. She needed coffee, something to cut through the fog of despair. As she passed a small, secluded alcove near the service elevators, a designated smoking area for staff, she heard 2 voices. They were low, tired. She recognized the women, 2 orderlies she'd seen on Ethan's floor. They were leaning against the brick wall, their cigarettes glowing in the dim light. "It's a real shame about that guy in 712, Ethan," one of them said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Such a nice young man. His poor wife looks like a ghost." The other one nodded, her voice raspy. "Yeah, a real tragedy. You know, it's funny. He reminds me so much of this guy I see back home." Chloe froze, her hand hovering over the coffee machine button. Her breath caught in her throat. "Back home? Where's that?" the first woman asked, flicking an ash onto the concrete. "Havenwood. It's this tiny town, a couple of hours south of here." "My sister lives there," the second orderly replied. "And there's this guy, Alex, who lives on the edge of town. Total recluse. A bit of a mess, to be honest. But I swear, He could be Ethan's twin brother. Same eyes, same build. It's uncanny. Every time I visit my sister, I see him, and I think of the patient in 712. The first woman scoffed. Probably just a coincidence, Sarah. You're seeing things. Maybe, Sarah conceded, taking another drag from her cigarette. But it's a crazy resemblance, like identical. Anyway, poor kid. Doesn't have any family, they say. No one to even test for a match. They put out their cigarettes and walked away, their conversation turning to shift changes and weekend plans. But Chloe remained frozen in place, their words echoing in her mind. Uncanny. Identical. Havenwood. A tiny, impossible spark of hope ignited in the darkness. Was it insane? Yes. A desperate, wild long shot, based on a random conversation between two strangers. But it was more than the nothing Dr. Thorne had offered her. For the first time in weeks, Chloe felt a surge of adrenaline instead of despair. She remembered Ethan once hiring a private investigator years ago in a half-hearted attempt to find his biological parents. The search had hit a brick wall. All the detective found was a name, Brenda Peterson, and a birthplace, a rural county that included the very area Sarah had mentioned. At the time, Ethan had called off the search, afraid of what he might find, or what he might not. He said he was content with the family he had built with her. But now, that forgotten piece of information clicked into place with the orderly story. It wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. It was a sign, a path. She had to go to Havenwood. She had to find this man named Alex. That night, Chloe didn't sleep. She sat at her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating her determined face. She researched Havenwood, Illinois. It was a small, forgotten town, a speck on the map with a declining population and a single main street. She looked at bus schedules, mapping out the 2.5-hour journey. She packed a small backpack with a change of clothes, a water bottle, and a charger. She printed out the best, clearest photo she had of Ethan, taken last summer at a Cubs game. He was laughing, his face full of life and joy, a healthy, vibrant man. Looking at it hurt, but she needed it. This picture was her key. She wrote a note for her parents, telling them she was following a lead and would call them. She didn't want to give them false hope, not yet. This was a mission she had to undertake alone. For the first time since the diagnosis, she had a purpose beyond just watching and waiting. The next morning she visited Ethan. He was weaker, dozing in and out of sleep. She held his hand, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. I have to go out of town for a day or so, for a work thing, she lied, hating the words as they left her mouth. My parents will be here with you. He opened his eyes, a flicker of his old self shining through. Be safe, Chloe, he whispered. Come back soon. I will, she promised, kissing his forehead. I promise. Leaving his room was one of the hardest things she'd ever done. Every instinct screamed at her to stay by his side, but a stronger, more desperate instinct pushed her forward, out of the hospital and toward the Greyhound bus station. The fate of the man in that room depended on a ghost story, a whisper of a resemblance in a town she'd never heard of. It was a fool's errand, and it was her only hope. The bus ride was a study in contrasts. It pulled away from the soaring steel and glass towers of downtown Chicago, moving through sprawling suburbs before the landscape flattened into the vast, unending farmland of central Illinois. The world outside her window turned from grey concrete to brown earth and pale, early spring sky. Chloe watched the city shrink in the distance, feeling a profound sense of isolation. She clutched the photo of Ethan in her bag, like a sacred relic. What would she even say? Excuse me, are you my dying husband's long-lost identical twin? The absurdity of it all washed over her, and for a moment she almost told the driver to turn around. But then she pictured Ethan's face, his brave, tired smile, and her resolve hardened. She would see this through, no matter how crazy it seemed. She owed him that much. Havenwood was even smaller and more desolate than she had imagined. The bus dropped her off in front of a closed-down diner with a faded Coca-Cola sign. The main street was lined with a few tired-looking storefronts, a post office, a dive bar, and a general store. A handful of pickup trucks were parked along the curb. The air was quiet, punctuated only by the distant cawing of a crow. Chloe felt like an alien who had landed on a different planet. She started walking, her city sneakers feeling out of place on the cracked pavement. She showed Ethan's photo to the woman behind the counter at the general store, an older lady with a kind, wrinkled face. "I'm looking for a man who lives here. Who looks like this," Chloe said, her voice unsteady. The woman peered at the photo over her glasses. Her eyes widened slightly. "Well, I'll be," she breathed. "You're looking for Alex Peterson. Lives out on the old Miller Road." "But honey, what would you want with him?" The woman's tone was a mix of curiosity and warning. "He keeps to himself, you know. Has for years. A little rough around the edges." She gave Chloe simple directions to a house on the outskirts of town, a place everyone seemed to know but no one seemed to visit. The walk took 20 minutes, taking her past modest houses and into a more rural area, where the road turned to gravel. Finally, she saw it. The house was set back from the road, small and dilapidated. The paint was peeling, the front porch sagged, and the yard was a chaotic mess of overgrown weeds, rusted car parts and empty beer bottles. A faded "No Trespassing" sign was nailed crookedly to a tree. Chloe's heart pounded against her ribs. This couldn't be right. What kind of person lived here? Steeling herself, she walked up the crumbling path and knocked on the splintered wooden door. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time. She could hear the faint sound of a television inside. After a long moment, the door creaked open a few inches. A man peered out, and Chloe's breath hitched. It was Ethan's face, but it was a version of Ethan seen through a distorted, broken mirror. His eyes, the same piercing green, were bloodshot and wary. His face was gaunt, but etched with deep lines of hardship and neglect. A rough, patchy beard covered his jaw, and his hair was long and unkempt. He was wearing a stained T-shirt and smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and whiskey. "What do you want?" he rasped, his voice low and suspicious. He looked her up and down, a city girl with a backpack, and his eyes narrowed. He was nothing like Ethan, and yet he was everything like him. It was the most surreal and terrifying moment of her life. "My name is Chloe," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I know this is going to sound crazy, but I need to show you something." Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get her phone out of her pocket. She pulled up the picture of Ethan from the Cubs game and held it out to him. The man, Alex, squinted at the screen. His guarded expression faltered. For a second, a flick of pure shock, of disbelief crossed his face. He stared at the smiling man on the screen, then back at Chloe, then back to the screen. The hostile mask dropped away, replaced by a raw, naked confusion. Who is that?" he asked, his voice cracking. "That's my husband, Ethan," Chloe said, tears welling in her eyes. "And he's dying. I think you might be his brother." He let her in. The inside of the house was even worse than the outside. It was cluttered and dark, with dusty furniture and piles of old newspapers. But Alex seemed to have forgotten his surroundings. He sank onto a worn-out armchair, never taking his eyes off the photo on Chloe's phone. She told him everything. She explained the disease, the desperate need for a bone marrow transplant, the fact that Ethan was an orphan who believed he had no family in the world. As she spoke, Alex listened in absolute silence, his face a stone mask, but she could see the turmoil in his eyes, a storm of emotions brewing beneath the surface. When she finished, the only sound in the room was the hum of an old refrigerator and the ticking of a clock on the wall. He stared into the distance, lost in a memory from a lifetime ago. "A brother," he finally whispered, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. "I always knew I had a brother." Then Alex began to talk. His voice was rusty, as if he wasn't used to telling long stories. He told her about their mother, Brenda, a woman who loved parties more than her own children. He described a childhood of poverty and neglect, of being the only boy among a rotating cast of sisters from different fathers. "Our house was chaos," he said, his gaze distant. Never enough food, never enough quiet. I was the man of the house by the time I was 8. I had to be. He told her he remembered when their mother was pregnant with Ethan. He was so excited. He had dreamed of having a brother, a partner in crime, an ally against the world. He was the only one who seemed to want the baby. His mother and older sisters complained about another mouth to feed. He remembered the day she came home from the hospital, her arms empty. She told me he died, Alex said, his voice thick with an ancient pain. She looked me right in the eye and said the baby, a girl she claimed, had died. A few days later, I overheard her talking to a friend, Alex continued, his hands clenched into tight fists. She was drunk, bragging. She said she'd given him up, a boy. She said he'd have a better chance with some rich, childless couple. She said she'd done him a favour. The bitterness in his voice was a tangible thing. I was just a kid. What could I do? I cried for weeks. I felt like a part of me had been ripped away. I spent my whole life wondering about him, wondering if he was okay, if he was happy. He looked at Chloe, his eyes full of a sorrow so profound, it made her own grief feel small. She let me believe he was dead. And you're telling me he's been alive this whole time. And now he's... He couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of 30 years of lies and loss hung heavy and suffocating in the small, dark room. It was a wound that had never healed, and Chloe had just torn it wide open. Suddenly, a small, bright voice cut through the heavy silence. "Uncle Alex, I'm home!" A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, burst through the front door. She had bright green eyes and a tangle of light brown hair. She looked so much like Ethan that Chloe gasped. The girl stopped short when she saw Chloe, her smile fading into shyness. "This is Mia," Alex said, his voice softening instantly. "My niece. My sister's kid." He explained that his sister had followed in their mother's footsteps, leaving Mia with him years ago before disappearing. "She's all I've got," he said, a fierce protective love in his eyes as he looked at the little girl. "I'm not much of a father figure, but I do my best." In that moment, Chloe saw past the rough exterior, the run-down house, and the smell of whiskey. She saw a man who, despite his own brokenness, had stepped up to care for a child, a man who had a good heart buried under a mountain of pain. Chloe looked from the innocent face of the little girl to the haunted face of the man who was her husband's brother. There was no question, there was no hesitation. "Alex," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I need you to come back to Chicago with me. I need you to get tested. You might be the only person on earth who can save him." Alex looked at Mia, then at Chloe's phone with the picture of his smiling, dying brother. The conflict on his face was agonizing. To leave this place, the only home he'd ever known, to confront a world that had forgotten him, and a brother who didn't even know he existed. It was an impossible choice. He took a deep, shaky breath. "Okay," he said, the word a quiet surrender. "Okay, I'll do it. For him, and for my sister, Lily." He told her then about another sister, a special needs girl he'd adored, who had died tragically as a child due to their mother's neglect. It was another layer of tragedy, another reason he had retreated from the world. The next morning, they drove back to Chicago in Chloe's car, which she'd arranged to have delivered. The journey was mostly silent. Alex sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the passing landscape as if seeing it for the first time. Mia was in the back, quietly playing with the small doll. The transition from the quiet despair of Havenwood to the bustling energy of the city was jarring. When they arrived at the hospital, the scale and gloss of the modern building seemed to intimidate Alex. Chloe led him through the automatic doors, past the busy reception, and up to the oncology ward. She had called Dr. Thorne from the road, briefly explaining the unbelievable situation. The doctor was sceptical but agreed to run the tests immediately. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," he'd warned, but Chloe could hear a sliver of hope in his voice. While Alex was in the lab, a process that involved a long and slightly painful blood draw, Chloe went to tell Ethan. She sat by his bed and took his hand. "Ethan, I found someone," she said softly. "I found your brother." He looked at her, his eyes clouded with confusion and the haze of medication. She explained the story in simple terms. The overheard conversation, the trip to Havenwood, the man named Alex, who looked just like him. Ethan just stared at her, struggling to process the information. A brother? After a lifetime of believing he was completely alone, a single tear traced a path down his hollow cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of something far more complex. Shock, wonder, and a lifetime of yearning condensed into a single silent drop. An hour later, Alex stood hesitantly in the doorway of room 712. Chloe had left to give them space. He looked at the frail man in the hospital bed, the man who should have been his partner against the world. Ethan turned his head slowly, and their eyes met for the first time. It was like looking at a ghost. They were the same, yet so different. One had escaped, the other had been left behind. One was dying, the other was broken. Words were not necessary. In that silent, shared gaze, 30 years of separation, of lies, of different lives, collapsed into a single heart-wrenching moment of recognition. Alex walked slowly to the bedside. "I'm Alex," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan reached out a weak hand. "I'm Ethan," he whispered. "My brother." Alex took his hand, and the two men, strangers and brothers, simply held on, a silent testament to a bond that had been stolen, but never truly broken. The next 3 days were an eternity. Alex and Mia stayed with Chloe's parents, who welcomed them with open arms, seeing not a rough stranger, but the brother who could save their son-in-law. Chloe spent every moment at the hospital, watching the slow, agonizing tick of the clock. Hope was a fragile, terrifying thing. She had dared to believe in a miracle, and now she feared it would be snatched away. Alex visited the hospital every day, sitting with Ethan for hours. They talked quietly, piecing together the broken fragments of their family story, sharing memories of lives lived in parallel universes. A quiet, powerful bond was forming between them, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of crisis. They were discovering the family they were both denied, even as they faced the possibility of losing it all over again. The call came on a Thursday morning. It was Dr. Thorne. Chloe's hand was shaking as she answered the phone. "Chloe," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice before he even said the words. "It's a perfect match, a 100% perfect match. I've never seen anything like it from a non-twin sibling." A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped Chloe's lips. She collapsed into a chair, the tears she had been holding back for months, finally flowing freely. It was real! The miracle was real. She ran to Ethan's room to tell him the news. He was with Alex, and when she told them, the two brothers just looked at each other, and a silent, profound understanding passed between them. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan's smile reached his eyes. Hope had returned to room 712, bright and brilliant and fierce. The transplant was a grueling, complex procedure, but it was a success. The recovery was long and difficult. Ethan spent another 2 months in the hospital, slowly rebuilding his strength, while his brother's healthy marrow worked its magic, creating a new life-saving immune system within him. Alex was there every step of the way. He became a fixture on the ward, a quiet, steady presence. During this time, Chloe and her parents took care of Mia. The little girl blossomed under the love and stability. She and Chloe formed an incredible bond. Chloe taught her to paint. They baked cookies together, and Chloe would read to her every night. For the first time, Chloe felt like a mother. She and Ethan had wanted a family so badly, and now, in the most unexpected way, they had one. They had a brother, and they had this wonderful, bright little girl who was healing their hearts as much as they were hers. After Ethan was finally released, he made his brother his first priority. With Ethan's support, Alex entered a rehab program to deal with the alcoholism that had been his crutch for so many years. He fought his demons with the same quiet determination his brother had used to build a life from scratch. While he was in treatment, Ethan and Chloe officially became Mia's legal guardians. Her biological mother was tracked down and willingly signed over her parental rights. unconcerned with the daughter she had abandoned. The adoption was finalised on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. That evening, the three of them, Chloe, Ethan and Mia, sat down for dinner in their apartment. Mia looked up from her plate and said, "Can I call you Mom and Dad?" Tears streamed down Chloe's face as Ethan, now healthy and strong, reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Of course you can, sweetheart," he said, his voice full of love. "Of course." 2 years later, life was unrecognisably beautiful. Ethan was back at work, healthier than ever. Alex, now sober and clear-eyed, also worked at Ethan's tech company, where his surprising knack for fixing complex hardware made him an invaluable member of the team. He used the money from the sale of his dilapidated house in Havenwood to get a small apartment just a few blocks away from Ethan and Chloe. The two brothers, who had spent a lifetime apart, were now inseparable. They coached Mia's soccer team together and had a standing poker night every Wednesday. Their family was a strange and wonderful mosaic, pieced together from broken parts to create something whole and strong. On a warm summer evening, Chloe watched from the kitchen window as Ethan and Alex taught Mia how to ride a bike in the park. The sound of their laughter drifted through the open window. It was the sound of a miracle, the sound of a family finally complete. In the end, it wasn't just about a bone marrow transplant. It was about transplanting a family. A stolen brotherhood was restored, a little girl was given the loving home she deserved, and the life that was meant to end became the beginning of a beautiful new story. Tragedy had led them to the brink of despair, but on the other side, they found a love and connection they never knew was possible. What started in a sterile hospital room ended with laughter in a sunlit park, a testament to the incredible power of hope and the unbreakable bonds that tie us together, even when we don't know they exist. Thank you so much for watching this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe for more powerful stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a miracle that defied all odds? Let us know.